Welcome to this episode of the Erasing Shame podcast. My name is DJ Chuang, and I'm joined by a therapist, Linda Yoon, with the Yellow Chair Collective. And content warning, we're going to be talking about the topic of domestic violence, as it is the month of October, and that is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And this is also related to family violence. And so we're going to raise some awareness about that, learn some things of what you can do to protect yourself and what to do if you know someone that you love or care about is in that kind of situation, how they can reach out for help. Linda, thank you for joining me on Erasing Shame.
Thank you for having me.
Now, in my own family of origin and in my own marriage and with my child, we don't experience violence, at least not in the physical sense. And I don't think we experience it in the traumatic sense either, or emotional sense per se. So I'm not sure how to talk about it. But yet I know it's a real issue for a significant number of people. I see when police make house calls that often is to intervene on behalf of someone experiencing domestic violence. And even in churches, there are people that experience abuse at home. So what insights or help can you share about these situations?
Yeah. Yes. Domestic violence, family violence, those are very heavy topics. And many don't know how to talk about it. And that's also why we need to talk about it because it happens more than we realize. And in my counseling practice, my own personal life, I did experience witnessed domestic violence and family violence. And becoming a social worker and work as a therapist, I am just encountering so many trauma stories of this violence, intergenerational violence, trauma that that is a lot more than people will expect, and it's very secretive, right? It takes so much courage, so much for them to be able to speak out because we're taught that those are not something we can talk about. It's very shameful, right? So I hope to talk about shine some light on family violence, domestic violence in America, especially within Asian American communities, and also why the barriers, and um, also share some resources, and perhaps we can also touch on what church, what can do, because my story also takes church and my pastors who did not know how to intervene, who did not know what to do with my family when they were informed of what was happening in my household.
Mm. Sometimes the violence happens and the threat is you cannot tell anybody because if you do, then you'll get hurt even more.
Definitely. It's definitely about power and control when there is a violence within family or partners. And it's about power, like what one partner, or it could be, it's not always clean cut. It could also be kind of like both, and creating some kind of violence as well. But it is ultimately about power and control, wanting to uh, control the other person to do what they want them to do. And when that doesn't happen, right, like perpetrators do not want you to be saying this out loud to other people, right? And I witnessed it in immigrant church community when there's domestic violence happen, but it's like it's a shameful thing to talk about. So the abuser make a lot of threats about if you make it known, or if you say anything, that they will come back with more violence. And unfortunately, I have witnessed that in domestic violence shelters that I volunteered and worked in before. Um, it it is very risky for a lot of victims to leave the relationship or the family because they know their abuser is capable of coming back and hurting you more.
Wow. I can tell it's such an emotional topic as a helper and then also from your life experience. So, what can a victim do? Because the abuser holds so much power, and often the victim doesn't have the resources to get out. And I
Yeah,
suppose if they do, then they could or would get out, but maybe it's not that simple.
it's it's very complicated. Um, just to relate to my personal family story, I so there was already domestic violence between my mom and dad, and then there also family violence where my parents also became violent, abusive time to time with me and my sister. But mainly, what we witnessed most violence was between them. And my mom, who was pretty educated uh, and pretty independent before she met my dad, uh, and but unfortunately, my dad's desire to control, like not just even desire, it's just almost like need to control my mom and then the family. That often led to violence. So like we wouldn't know what would set him off. Like it could be something like I didn't do my homework to something little to that like we are making some kind of decision against his will. It and I uh and in Korea there wasn't any. So I grew up in Korea for first 11 years of my life. In Korea, like it felt like it happened more, and I know my mom wasn't the only one who was experiencing that. So it felt, and there wasn't any help at that time back in 80s and 90s. People are talking about it, but there's not much help. Like, where do you even go? And Asia is such a collective society. It's all about saving face. So, having experiencing something like that, it's almost like you're uh, you're bringing shame to the family that you're experiencing your victim, right? So victims cannot say anything to protect the family and also protect. I think my mom was also trying to protect me and my sister. It doesn't have a good look that your father is an abuser, right? Um, and when we moved to US, things got a little bit more worse because now we don't speak the language, we don't have resources, and my dad also started to kind of threaten that it because we all knew like in our hearts that this is a crime, right? This is illegal. This should not be happening. That if people found out or called the law enforcement, then it will be because my dad is a person who brought us. He had a sponsor from his company, and then that's how we moved to US. That means that we will all get kicked out of from the US, and we will be this criminal sent back, and that we will not, like, he made a very dramatic narratives to us that we will never find a job, we will be shamed from the society, that is a secret that we have to keep as a family, even as a victims too, because you will yeah, otherwise that we don't have, in a way,
Mm.
otherwise we don't have future. And no, coming from
Mm.
collective society, that can feel really real. Like people's judgment, how people see you, even you, it's not your fault. Even you're the victim. Like there's so much shame in it. So
Yeah, it's hard to tell if he was telling the truth.
yeah, especially as a young child, right? And my mom
Mhm,
also, even though she was pretty educated back in
mhm,
Korea, she didn't speak the language.
mhm,
She didn't speak English, and it's such a whole new system. So we're just relying on my father 100% who brought us to
Wow.
US. So it really
Wow.
things were difficult in
So,
Korea as it was,
mhm,
uh, and lack of resources. But coming to US, like even there were resources, was it accessible to us, right? As a
mhm,
first generation immigrant
mhm,
who um, don't know how to speak the language, how to access. And later, working as a social worker and therapist, I met a lot of domestic violence victims and who are Korean, right? They were so afraid to reach out for help.
mhm,
There's deportation, like how my dad made narratives.
mhm,
Like there's deportation fears, which is not true because there are protective
mhm,
laws around that if you're a victim, but people don't know that, right? So
mhm,
fear of deportation, and even they get help. Like how are they gonna communicate what's happening to them, and how are they gonna start uh, build their life, especially if they don't know the language and culture, or they're not comfortable, familiar, right? Um, like we live in Los Angeles where we have a pretty large Asian population and we have
mhm,
some resources, but it's still really not enough. And a lot of workers who work in that environment get burnt out
mhm, mhm.
really fast, and it's hard having that resources kind of continue and then being able to support the victims at times for that reasons. Yeah.
Well, there's so many layers to this, and thank you for sharing. First of all, thank you for sharing your um, experience so openly, and I hope that gives people courage
Yeah.
to reach out for help.
Mhm.
How? I mean, you're talking about your own family, so I'm guessing you're at a place where that came to some kind of resolution. How did that happen?
Yeah. It took me a long time to make sense out of it. I did have friends who also experienced family violence growing up.
Mm,
So, especially in Korea, we lived
mm,
not in a city and kind of outside of city. And I knew my grandparents also had domestic violence, uh,
mm,
and especially my dad's side. Like this is where generational trauma also kind of weave into it because my dad's father um, was a very violent person.
mm,
He was never violent to me, to his grandkids, but like I witnessed him being violent towards my grandmother, right? And
mm,
my dad, and then his children, my dad and my aunts. And my dad just grew up witnessing all those violence, right? Um, actually, the violence was so bad towards my dad, but my dad became deaf one ear. I don't know the
wow.
specific um,
Mhm,
terms of it. Uh, and that was that was his life, right?
mhm,
That he grew up, so he kind of like passed down to us. And my mom
mhm,
also, who grew up witnessing that
mm,
her father, being violent towards her mom once in a while. That like she
mm,
kind of kept it going, and then back in the days, they really thought. My mom really thought it was the best for me and my sister to have a family because there was a lot of stigma around divorce as well, right?
mhm,
So she just took that in. And what's the interesting thing is my dad later, when I became adult, um, and making a lot of boundaries around like, no, you cannot touch, you cannot hit me, you cannot yell at me, you cannot speak to me that in certain ways.
mhm,
And also my parents now are separated for their own safety.
mm,
Yeah, I'm glad that finally happened. It just took a long time. Uh, like we were able to have some conversation. Like it's not easy, but we were able to get to, my mom and I were kind of able to get to, is that my dad does feel guilty. There's a lot of shame around what he did. Uh, but at the same time, he is really stuck in his own trauma. like how he was hurt and how much his father was worse. So in some ways, it's like, oh yeah, like you discipline your kids, you discipline your wife by violence. You don't listen to me. That kind of thinking was in
Mm,
him. But also he was kind of making sense uh, that it was better than his father because he didn't make anybody get injured to the point.
mm,
So that was that was a point. I'm like, okay, so I guess that's where we're drawing line. Where that's how far my dad can go at this time. Uh, it's hard for Asian men, immigrant men of his generation to go therapy.
mhm,
Like that's not something he will dig into. It's too painful. It's too deep. Um, so I wish he will have some space to really find his own healing. But for me, like I had to make choice of like I'm not gonna pass this down, this intergenerational trauma, intergenerational violence. But
mhm,
unfortunately, my early 20s, when I started dating, because I was so used to dynamics, right? Like that was kind of power and control. I have, you know, I haven't gotten like a physical violence kind of relationship dynamic, but definitely been into dynamics that reminded of my parents, like that power and control
wow.
early on. And I had to really recognize that and break out of it because it felt so familiar to me, right? Those chaos. And I like to talk about it with my clients sometimes, like, yeah, that chaos sometimes can feel like a chemistry because you feel like you're like, oh, it feels so right because you're used to
Mm,
it. But you have to recognize it, the patterns that you want to break out of, new relationships that you want to make. And sometimes that healthy relationship can feel boring, or a healthy relationship can feel like weird because it's not chaotic anymore. And that's something that
mhm,
we had to talk a lot about in my domestic violence clients that I have, because it's just easier to go back to that relationship over and over again.
mm, mm,
Sometimes those chaos are addictive,
mm.
interestingly, in our emotion highs and lows. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very peculiar thing about our human development, that there's a part of our emotional being and neurology that is more comfortable with the familiar,
Hmm.
even though it is not healthy.
Yeah,
And
definitely.
so, whether that's family upbringing and unhealthy patterns of behavior, or unhealthy ways of eating, unhealthy ways of relating, we don't know differently when we haven't had the life experience of healthy living. And so,
Yeah, and
um,
that doesn't come until you are able to really reflect on it, become
mhm,
aware, and realizing that there's other ways um, of having relationships. And for generations,
yeah,
for my family, it's like they didn't
hmm,
have that. So that was
hmm,
something that definitely was difficult for me. I
hmm,
working in domestic violence shelters, and that did
yeah,
help me to recognize some. And now I'm a therapist and social worker.
yes,
Uh, so working in that industry, I was able to also recognize, and also kind of like being stuck in same patterns, right? It's not working, and you have to at one point. It's like, what is going on? Yeah.
hmm. Well, I'm so glad you're in a better place and you're experiencing health. Thank you for dedicating so much of your life to helping others as a social worker and now as a therapist. Um, and we know it's hard work to heal.
It is.
So sometimes people resist getting the help to heal because, well, they don't know what it's like. They
Yeah.
have the shame of getting help or seeing a therapist. And then when it's really hard work, it's like, oh, they just want to give up. All kinds of dynamics like that. So it's common in therapy. They say depression, anxiety, and some other mental illnesses. But how often do you come across people that are experiencing this kind of situation in their lives, and how do you encourage them to persist, to grow, and to get healthy?
Um, when I was working in domestic violence shelters,
Hmm.
definitely saw pretty much all my clients were experiencing
Mm,
domestic violence or family violence. Now, in private practice setting, the number is less, but it's still, I wouldn't say it's a low number. It may be because I do specialize in working with complex trauma, uh,
mm.
experiencing years of abuse, violence, like that does lead to complex trauma often. Um,
Yeah, that's what it's kind of called now in terms of
mhm,
the impact of
yeah,
that kind of situation. Yes.
yeah. Uh, so right now, before I was seeing more victims who are still in those dynamics or still trying to get out initially, right? I am working a lot with children who grew up
Mm,
witnessing domestic violence or experience family violence or who have experienced intimate partner violence, but it's not too recent. And then they're trying to make sense out of it, whether they're trying to break out of patterns, relationship patterns, or just trying to heal. Because when you grow up witnessing so much violence, it really and then there's a lot of power and control, right? There's a lot of, there's a, often goes with gaslighting, emotional, verbal
mm,
abuse. It's never just physical violence, barely. And like really recovering from that, like how do you reclaim who you are again? Like how do
mhm,
you learn to live without feeling like you're you're nothing or not
mhm,
lovable, right? Or like, and then physical or sexual violation is very deep violation, and I feel like it's another taking you to another level of can I be safe? Like people don't feel safe physically.
mhm,
So uh, it takes time and takes many layers to heal from that. And a lot of times it's really helpful to know that you're not alone. And then there
mhm,
are support groups for people are um, who are survivors of domestic violence or family violence. But it is still very shameful thing to talk about in Asian families. Um, so that has been really difficult. But yeah, it's like healing circles, support groups, also actually really learning the dynamics of domestic violence and like why you felt that way or you internalize certain beliefs about you that are not healthy or that are not true about you, and they're
mhm,
really able to release them in some ways, being able to reclaim your identity, reclaim who you are, your life back,
mhm,
above all, like finding how do I feel safe again, right? Like I think
mhm,
victims of violence, safety is the big thing. They do not feel safe, even if they have moved away from abusers nowhere, uh, because it was so real, and unfortunately, there's a higher risk, as you mentioned earlier, when these victims try to leave, the abuser can come back and abuse more, which I definitely have seen. And a lot of domestic violence shelters, they don't have an address. Like you will not know. So when
mhm,
the victims call and they'll let you know how to get there, they're not gonna tell you the address to
mhm,
protect the victims. And I remember we had a strict rule for victims. The main rule living there was that you do not tell where you are to your victims
mhm.
because you risk everybody's safety. So those are aspects that that can come out. Yeah.
Wow. Well, thank you for walking us through a pathway of recovery and how someone can go from a terrible situation in their family or with their relationships that are abusive or violent to one of healing and hope and restoration and safety that is possible, and you've laid down a good number of breadcrumbs. And the first step is really, I suppose, to reach out for help.
Yeah, first
And
step is reach out for help. I do want to mention,
mhm,
church, like a lot of Asian immigrant, especially being Korean American, like Korean Americans, traditionally have like big, church, um, immigrant society, right?
mhm,
And it, I think it's really hard for the community pastor, the church leader to address, because my father was a well liked person, community member, church community member, right?
mm,
And I heard from others too, like the abusers, like a deacon, even pastors sometimes,
wow.
right?
Mhm,
Like that becomes very very difficult to address, right? I don't have the whole answer. This is something that I am still like, oh, how can church be better, be helpful with these victims? Um,
mhm,
but unfortunately, what I heard and myself heard, and some other victims that I have talked to, been told is, just forgive the victim, abuser.
mm,
Um, yeah, unfortunately. I'm hearing that with second generation, third generation churches, like things are a little different, but definitely in immigrant first generation churches, like they had no idea what to do, and they rather not see it, ignore it, just tell the victims to forgive, forget, or do family
mm,
therapy, counseling to fix it. Um, what There are now programs for church leaders, how to address mental health issues along with like domestic violence issues. So kind of utilizing those programs. I know Korean American family services, like, they used to have
mm,
those programs, and I know other faith church communities are also having that. And knowing that even you may not be aware, you may have victims in the church.
mm,
Uh, like I remember my mother, her church, she was in San Jose for a while. She used to go to this Korean immigrant church, and they had this great project, like learning how to do peer counseling. So
mm,
it was run by a psychologist, church member who was kind of training the church community member to be peer counselor. It was really great program, and my mom really enjoyed it. But one of the less talks that psychologists had was that they're addressing domestic violence, family violence, and kind of talked as if she doesn't understand why victims stay, and she kind of talked down about the victims.
mhm,
My mom just being there, and and there's a lot more that could go into like why victims stay, which feels like I need to be another like episode. But like not assuming that because you don't know that that may not be happening, because we really don't know. And then yeah, my church didn't know what was happening for years. It was only when I spoke to my youth pastor, and then it went to my senior pastor, which didn't lead anywhere, because I was told that we just have to pray more and forgive. Wasn't really helpful, unfortunately. And then um, but like nobody knew, and then people didn't know what to do. But I also knew in my youth group there were other kids who were also experiencing that as well. Yeah.
mm. Wow, such a complicated issue, and I'm glad you're bringing some of it to light so that we can work towards more solutions because a lot more help needs to happen. The other thing I hear in faith context is, yeah, just forgive the person, or oh, if you're abused, just leave. and it's not that simple.
No, it's
And
not.
so it takes all of us helping each other to really navigate the nuances and complexity of violence in Asian American communities. So
Yeah.
thank you for starting the conversation. And we invite people here on Erasing Shame to give us your feedback. We're hosted on Spotify now, so you can leave a comment or even a voice message, and we'll get that to Linda and continue this conversation and see what we could do together. And also at erasingshame.com, we'll add links in the show notes, so you can reach out to Linda. If her story really resonated with you, she's available for therapy and she's got lived experience. So as much as she's available, she could connect you with resources, and then I'll look up some additional resources that Linda you mentioned,
Yes,
like
I will definitely send it to you.
violence preventions program. So that would be really, really helpful.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank
Well,
you.
thank you for tuning in to the Erasing Shame podcast, Linda. It's been a joy connecting with you. I'm so glad you're in a much better place in life and able to help others. Great connecting with you. Thank you
Yeah,
so
thank you
much.
for the invitation. Thank you.
Blessing to you. Bye bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Erasing Shame podcast. Check out the show notes at erasingshame.com and subscribe to our email for updates. We would love to hear from you, so please add your comments at our website or on social. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any podcast app, and you can also subscribe on YouTube or follow on Facebook. Please add a rating and reviews so we can reach more people with our message of health, hope, and compassion. This podcast is the digital outreach of Christian Asian mental health.